My name is Jessica Martinez, and 2 years ago, I was 28 years old with a dream that seemed impossible to everyone around me. I wanted to join the elite Storm Ridge Military Training Academy, a place where only the toughest soldiers earned their stripes. My acceptance letter came as a shock to most people, including my own family. I didn't have the typical background. No military family legacy, no senator's recommendation letter, no connections whatsoever. I was a small-town girl from Nevada who'd worked her way through community college while training in mixed martial arts and survival skills. My father, a construction worker who'd passed away 3 years earlier, had always told me that strength comes from within, not from what others think you deserve. The day I arrived at Storm Ridge, the facility looked like something out of a movie. Sprawling desert compound with imposing concrete buildings and training grounds that stretched to the horizon. Other recruits were already forming groups, and I could hear conversations about whose father was a general, whose uncle was in special forces. I kept my mouth shut and focused on unpacking my single duffel bag. That's when I first encountered Sergeant Major William "Tank" Morrison. He was a mountain of a man, probably 6'4", with arms like tree trunks and a voice that could shatter glass. He commanded respect just by walking into a room. During our first briefing, he paced in front of our formation like a predator sizing up prey. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, though his eyes lingered on me and the 2 other women in our group of 40, "welcome to Storm Ridge. Some of you belong here. Some of you are about to find out you don't." The first red flag should have been obvious, but I was too focused on proving myself to notice. After the briefing, Tank pulled me aside. "Martinez," he said, looking me up and down with barely concealed disdain. "Let me guess, diversity quota?" I felt my face flush. "No, sir. I'm here because I earned it." He laughed, a cold sound that made my skin crawl. "We'll see about that. Word of advice. Pack light. You won't be here long." That night, lying in my narrow bunk, I stared at the ceiling and tried to push down the growing knot in my stomach. I'd worked too hard to get here to let one man's prejudice derail my dreams. But as I listened to the other recruits chatting about their family connections and previous military experience, I realized I was more alone than I'd ever been in my life. The next morning brought our first training evaluation. Tank announced the rules. Full combat gear, 5-mile run through the desert, followed by weapons assessment. Standard stuff, except for one detail that made my blood run cold. "Equipment will be distributed alphabetically," Tank announced, his eyes finding mine in the crowd. "No trading, no complaints. You get what you get." When my turn came, Tank personally handed me my gear. The moment I lifted the pack, I knew something was wrong. It had to weigh at least 20 pounds more than regulation. The boots were a size too small, and the rifle looked like it had seen better decades. "Problem, Martinez?" Tank asked with a smirk. "No, sir," I replied, hefting the pack onto my shoulders. As I jogged toward the starting line, struggling with the oversized pack, I caught snippets of conversation from other recruits. Someone mentioned that Martinez got the special treatment. Another voice laughed about washing out the dead weight early. I gritted my teeth and took my position. Whatever game Tank was playing, I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing me quit on day 1. The run nearly killed me. While other recruits moved with standard weight packs, I struggled through the desert sand with what felt like a bag of concrete strapped to my back. My feet were blistering in the 2 small boots, and sweat poured down my face as I fought to keep pace. Halfway through, I started falling behind. The pack's weight was throwing off my balance, and every step felt like torture. Behind me, I could hear Tank's voice booming from the jeep that followed the stragglers. "Pick up the pace, Martinez. This isn't a casual stroll." By the time I reached the weapons station, I was dead last. My hands were shaking from exhaustion as I picked up the rifle Tank had assigned me. The sight was clearly misaligned, and the trigger felt sticky. During the shooting assessment, my shot scattered wildly across the target. 0 out of 10, Tank announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. Looks like our quota recruit needs to work on her marksmanship. The other recruits snickered. I wanted to speak up to point out the obvious sabotage, but I knew it would only make things worse. Instead, I bit my tongue and endured the humiliation. After the assessment, I approached Tank privately. "Sir, I think there might have been an issue with my equipment today." His expression turned ice cold. "Are you suggesting I don't know how to do my job, Martinez?" "No, sir, Because if you're looking for excuses this early in training, maybe you should reconsider whether you're cut out for Storm Ridge." The conversation was over. As I walked away, I heard him talking to his assistant instructor, Sergeant Davis. "Keep an eye on that one," Tank said. "Some people need extra motivation to realize when they're out of their depth." That evening, I discovered my locker had been randomly inspected. While I was at dinner, my personal items were scattered across the floor, including family photos that had been bent and crumpled. When I asked the other recruits if anyone else had been inspected, they all shook their heads. I spent the night quietly reorganizing my belongings, fighting back tears of frustration. This wasn't training. This was targeted harassment. But complaining would only confirm Tank's belief that I didn't belong here. The next few days followed the same pattern. Every piece of equipment I received was somehow defective or inappropriate. During group exercises, I was consistently paired with recruits who made it clear they thought I was a liability. Tank's commentary during my performance evaluations was harsh enough to make other instructors look uncomfortable. "Martinez demonstrates poor judgment under pressure," he announced after I struggled through an obstacle course with a harness that kept coming loose. "Lacks the physical capabilities necessary for advanced training." One evening, another female recruit named Amanda pulled me aside. "You need to know," she whispered. "They're taking bets on how long you'll last. Tank told everyone you'd be gone by week 2. My heart sank, but I also felt something else, a spark of defiance. My father had always taught me that when someone tries to tear you down, you have 2 choices: crumble or prove them wrong. I chose to prove them wrong. Week 2 brought new humiliations. Tank seemed to take personal pleasure in finding ways to make my life miserable. During morning inspections, my bunk was always found lacking, even when I'd spent an hour making it perfect. My meal portions were consistently smaller than everyone else's. During combat training, I was paired against recruits who outweighed me by 50 pounds. But the worst part was the isolation. Tank's obvious disdain for me had given the other recruits permission to treat me like a pariah. Conversation stopped when I approached. No one wanted to be partnered with me during exercises. I ate meals alone while listening to the easy camaraderie at other tables. The breaking point came during a particularly brutal training exercise called Desert Storm. We were divided into teams and tasked with navigating a complex obstacle course while carrying a wounded teammate on a stretcher. Tank announced the teams, and when he got to mine, I wasn't surprised to hear my name called last. "Team Charlie," he announced. Rodriguez, Thompson, Baker, and Martinez. The 3 men assigned to my team couldn't hide their disappointment. Rodriguez, a cocky kid from Texas with family, Tank, who had been watching from his Jeep, drove over with a look of theatrical concern. "Problem, Martinez? Need medical attention?" I could taste blood from where I'd bitten my tongue, and my shoulder was screaming in pain, but I shook my head. "No, sir. I'm fine." "Good. Wouldn't want to hold up the entire exercise for one person's limitations." We finished the course dead last, and Tank made sure everyone knew whose fault it was. "Team Charlie's performance was unacceptable," he announced. "When you have a weak link, the entire chain fails." That night, I sat alone in the bathroom, examining the bruises that covered my arms and shoulders. For the first time since arriving at Storm Ridge, I seriously considered quitting. I could pack my bag, request a transfer, and walk away from this nightmare. No one would blame me. But then I remembered my father's words. The world will try to tell you what you're worth, Major. Don't listen. Show them instead. I made a decision that would change everything. If Tank wanted to play games, I would learn to play them better than he could ever imagine. Week 3 brought the ultimate test of Tank's cruelty. Storm Ridge's signature challenge was something called the Crucible, a grueling 48-hour survival exercise in the deep desert. Recruits were dropped off with minimal supplies and had to navigate back to base while completing various checkpoints. The night before the Crucible, Tank called me into his office. "Martinez," he said, not bothering to look up from his paperwork. "I've been reviewing your performance." He slid a folder across his desk. Inside were evaluation forms covered in red ink, photos of my failed exercises, and incident reports documenting every stumble and mistake. "Frankly, I'm concerned about sending you into the Crucible. The desert can be unforgiving to someone who lacks preparation." I studied his face, trying to read his intentions. "I'm ready, sir." "Are you?" He leaned back in his chair. "Because I've seen recruits get lost out there. Dehydration, heat stroke, snake bites. Last year, we had to medevac someone who couldn't handle the pressure." His words were wrapped in false concern, but the threat was clear. He was setting me up to fail spectacularly. "I've made some special arrangements for your exercise," he continued. "You'll be dropped at Checkpoint Alpha, about 10 miles farther out than the standard starting point. Consider it extra credit." My stomach dropped. Checkpoint Alpha was in the deepest, most dangerous part of the desert. It would add hours to an already brutal exercise. "Sir, is that standard procedure?" His smile was predatory. "Nothing about your situation is standard, Martinez. You wanted to prove you belong here. This is your chance." I left his office knowing I was walking into a trap, but I also knew I had no choice. Backing down now would confirm everything Tank believed about me. The next morning, I was loaded into a jeep with 2 other recruits, Rodriguez and a quiet kid named Parker. As we drove deeper into the desert, I noticed we were going much farther than the standard drop-off point. When the jeep finally stopped, we were in the middle of nowhere with nothing but sand and scrub brush in every direction. "Checkpoint Alpha," Tank announced over the radio. "Martinez, this is your stop." Rodriguez looked confused. "Sir, isn't Alpha the advanced starting point?" Martinez requested extra credit. Tank replied smoothly, "We're happy to accommodate." I gathered my minimal supplies, a canteen, compass, energy bars, and a map, and climbed out of the jeep. As it drove away with the other recruits, I was left alone in the vast emptiness of the desert. The first few hours weren't too bad. I had trained in desert survival, and I knew how to pace myself and conserve water. But as the sun climbed higher and the temperature soared past 110 degrees, I began to understand the true scope of Tank's sabotage. My map was marked with checkpoints I was supposed to reach, but several of them were impossibly far apart. The distances would be challenging for a well-supplied team. For one person with limited water, they were potentially deadly. By midday, I was rationing my water carefully, taking tiny sips every hour. My lips were cracked, my vision was starting to blur from the heat, and I was still miles from the first checkpoint. That's when I discovered Tank's final trick. As I crested a ridge, I spotted another recruit in the distance, Thompson, one of the guys from my disastrous team exercise. He was sitting in the shade of a rock formation, relaxing with what looked like a full water bottle. I approached cautiously, hoping we could work together to reach the checkpoints. But as I got closer, Thompson stood up with a smirk. Well, look what the desert dragged in." "Thompson," I croaked, my voice hoarse from dehydration. "Are you heading to Checkpoint Bravo?" "Already been there," he said casually. "Got my stamp hours ago." My heart sank. If Thompson had already reached Checkpoint Bravo, and he'd started at the same time as me, but from a closer position, I was impossibly behind schedule. "How much water do you have left?" I asked, eyeing his full bottle. He followed my gaze and laughed. This. Oh, this isn't from my ration. Tank made sure I had extra supplies. Can't have the good recruits suffering because of poor planning. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Tank hadn't just sabotaged my starting position. He'd arranged for other recruits to receive extra support while I struggled with the minimum. Listen, Martinez, Thompson continued, Tank told me to give you a message if I ran into you out here. He says it's not too late to call for extraction. Medical emergency, dehydration, whatever. No shame in admitting when you're beaten. I stared at him for a long moment, processing the full scope of Tank's manipulation. This wasn't training. It was a coordinated effort to break me. But standing there in the blazing sun, with my water running low and my body pushed to its limits, I felt something unexpected. Clarity. Tank thought he could force me to quit by making the challenge impossible. He assumed I would crumble under pressure and prove his prejudices right. But he had made one crucial mistake. He had underestimated just how stubborn I could be when someone tried to tell me what I couldn't do. I looked Thompson in the eye and smiled. Tell Tank I said thanks for the extra challenge. I'll see him at graduation. With that, I turned and walked away, leaving Thompson staring after me in disbelief. I didn't have extra water, extra supplies, or extra time. But I had something Tank couldn't take away from me. The absolute refusal to give up. The real fight was just beginning. That night, as I huddled in a makeshift shelter I'd built from scrub brush and rocks, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of just surviving Tank's challenges, I was going to beat them so thoroughly that he couldn't ignore or dismiss my success. I had grown up in the Nevada desert. My father had taught me how to find water by reading the landscape, how to navigate by the stars, and how to make the hostile environment work for me instead of against me. Tank thought he was punishing me by sending me into the deep desert alone. He'd actually given me a chance to showcase skills that most of these academy-trained recruits had never developed. Using techniques my father had taught me, I found a small seep spring that wasn't marked on any map. It was barely a trickle, but it was clean water. I refilled my canteen and cached extra water in my emergency containers. Then I studied my map more carefully, looking for patterns that the other recruits would miss. The checkpoints weren't randomly placed. They followed old mining roads and cattle paths that crisscrossed the desert. If I abandoned the obvious routes and cut across country using these forgotten trails, I could actually reach some checkpoints faster than recruits who started from closer positions. By dawn, I was moving with new purpose. Instead of struggling to keep up with Tank's impossible timeline, I was ahead of it. When I reached Checkpoint Bravo, the instructor manning the station did a double take. Martinez, you're not supposed to be here for another 6 hours. Just eager to keep moving, sir, I replied, getting my map stamped. Word spread quickly through the instructor network. Tank's voice crackled over the radio, demanding to know how I'd reached Bravo so fast. I could hear the confusion and irritation in his tone. But I was just getting started. Using my knowledge of desert survival, I reached Checkpoint Charlie 3 hours ahead of schedule. Then Checkpoint Delta. By the time I reached the final checkpoint, I wasn't just beating Tank's timeline. I was on pace to set a new course record. The instructor at the final checkpoint, a gruff master sergeant named Williams, looked genuinely impressed. Martinez, right? Tank said you were struggling with the basic requirements. No, sir, I replied. I was just getting warmed up. When I walked into the base compound that evening, a full day ahead of schedule, the entire atmosphere shifted. Recruits who had been treating me like a liability suddenly looked at me with new respect. Instructors whispered among themselves, checking and rechecking the timing logs. Tank was waiting for me at the finish line, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. Martinez, he said through gritted teeth. Report to my office in 1 hour. Yes, sir, I replied, too exhausted to feel anything but grim satisfaction. But before I could enjoy my victory, I needed to document everything. Over the next hour, I carefully wrote down every detail of Tank's sabotage, the modified equipment, the extended starting point. Thompson's confession about extra supplies. I photographed the gear I'd been given, noting serial numbers and obvious defects. Most importantly, I started paying attention to how Tank treated other recruits. I wasn't his only target, just his primary one. He consistently gave female recruits harder assignments, harsher critiques, and inferior equipment. He made crude comments about women in combat roles and actively discouraged other instructors from offering support to female trainees. When I reported to Tank's office, he was pacing behind his desk like a caged animal. "I don't know how you cheated," he said without preamble, "but I will find out." "I didn't cheat, sir. I just used the skills you're supposed to be testing." His face flushed red. "Don't get smart with me, Martinez. One good performance doesn't erase weeks of failure." "My failures," I said carefully, "seemed to correlate strongly with defective equipment and modified parameters." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Tank leaned across his desk, his voice low and threatening. "Are you accusing me of something, recruit?" I met his gaze steadily. "I'm just noting patterns, sir." For a moment, I thought he might actually lose his temper completely. But then he sat back in his chair, a cold smile spreading across his face. "Fine. You want to play games? Tomorrow's exercise is urban combat simulation. Full contact, live ammunition, no safety restrictions. Let's see how your desert tricks work in a real firefight." I left his office knowing that Tank had just escalated our conflict to a dangerous new level. But I also knew something he didn't. I'd been documenting everything, and I wasn't fighting this battle alone anymore. That night, I reached out to Amanda, the other female recruit who'd warned me about the betting pool. She introduced me to two other women who'd been quietly enduring their own campaigns of harassment. Together, we started comparing notes. The pattern was unmistakable. Tank systematically targeted female recruits, using a combination of impossible standards, defective equipment, and social isolation to force them to quit. 3 women had already transferred out rather than endure his harassment. But Tank had made one crucial mistake. He'd picked a fight with someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The urban combat simulation was Tank's masterpiece of malicious planning. The exercise involved clearing a mock city populated with instructors playing hostile forces. Recruits were equipped with specialized ammunition that could deliver painful but non-lethal impacts, essentially high-tech paintball with enough force to leave serious bruises. Tank's briefing was longer than usual, and his eyes kept finding mine as he outlined the rules. "This exercise separates the warriors from the wannabes," he announced. "You'll be facing experienced combat veterans who won't hesitate to exploit any weakness." He paused dramatically. "Martinez, since you seem to excel at solo operations, you'll be taking the North Sector." "Alone." Murmurs rippled through the group. The North Sector was the most difficult area of the simulation, designed for teams of 4 to 6 recruits. Sending one person in alone was either a death sentence or a setup for spectacular failure. But I'd been expecting something like this. Tank couldn't let my crucible success stand without trying to tear me down again. "Sir," I said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "could you clarify the standard team size for the North Sector?" Tank's jaw tightened. "Team composition is at the discretion of the exercise commander." "Of course, sir. I just want to make sure I understand the modified parameters." By emphasizing modified parameters, I was making it clear to everyone present that Tank was once again changing the rules specifically for me. I could see some of the other instructors exchanging glances. The simulation began at dawn. While other recruits moved through their sectors in coordinated teams, I entered the North Sector's maze of buildings and alleyways alone. Almost immediately, I came under fire from multiple positions. But Tank had made another crucial error in his planning. By forcing me to operate solo, he'd unknowingly played to my strengths. I'd grown up hunting in terrain just like this. Abandoned mining towns and ghost settlements where individual stealth and patience mattered more than team coordination. I moved through the simulation like a phantom, using shadows and blind spots to avoid the instructor teams. When I had to engage, I struck fast and disappeared before they could coordinate a response. My small size, which Tank saw as a weakness, allowed me to move through spaces where larger recruits couldn't follow. 2 hours into the exercise, I'd cleared 3/4 of my sector while the team-based groups were still bogged down in coordinated assaults. Radio chatter indicated that the instructors in my sector were getting frustrated. They couldn't pin down a target they couldn't find. That's when I stumbled onto something that changed everything. While moving through the simulation's command post, I overheard a radio conversation between Tank and one of his subordinates. "Sir, Martinez is making us look like amateurs out here. She's cleared more objectives solo than most teams manage with full support." Tank's voice crackled back with barely controlled fury. "Then stop playing games. Use the override codes and end this." "Sir, that would require falsifying the exercise results." "Do you have a problem following orders, Sergeant?" There was a long pause. "No, sir. Initiating system override." I realized I was listening to Tank order his subordinates to cheat, to artificially alter the simulation results to make me fail. But I was also recording everything on the digital device we'd been issued to log our tactical decisions. Over the next hour, I watched as my successful objective completions were mysteriously reversed in the system. Buildings I'd cleared were marked as failed. Targets I'd eliminated reappeared as active threats. The simulation was being manipulated in real time to manufacture my failure, but Tank had made one final crucial mistake. The same system he was using to falsify my results was automatically creating a digital trail of every modification. Every override, every altered timestamp, every falsified entry was being logged with his authorization codes. When the exercise ended, Tank announced the results with theatrical disappointment. Martinez failed to clear her assigned sector and showed poor tactical judgment throughout the exercise. But this time, I was ready for him. "Sir," I said, holding up my recording device, "I'd like to request a formal review of the exercise logs." Tank's face went pale. "That won't be necessary, recruit." "Actually, sir, I believe regulations require documentation review for any exercise where safety protocols are modified." I was gambling on Tank's own rule-following nature. He was too much of a by-the-book soldier to refuse a formal request for documentation, especially in front of other instructors. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "We'll review the logs." What happened next was the beginning of Tank's downfall. When the logs were pulled, they showed clear evidence of systematic result manipulation. Multiple instructors had been ordered to falsify exercise outcomes, not just for me, but for other female recruits over the course of months. Master Sergeant Williams, who'd been quietly documenting his own concerns about Tank's methods, stepped forward with additional evidence. Other instructors, freed by Williams's example, began sharing their own observations about Tank's discriminatory practices. Within 48 hours, Tank was suspended pending a formal investigation. The base commander, Colonel Patricia Hayes, personally interviewed every recruit who'd been affected by Tank's harassment campaign. But the real victory came when Colonel Hayes announced Tank's permanent removal from training duties. Storm Ridge produces elite soldiers regardless of gender, background, or connections. She declared during a base-wide assembly, "Anyone who undermines that mission has no place in our organization." Tank's reign of terror was over, but the impact of his downfall was just beginning. Tank's suspension sent shockwaves through Storm Ridge, but his supporters weren't going down without a fight. Within days of the investigation's announcement, I began experiencing a new form of harassment, this time from recruits and instructors who viewed Tank as a hero and me as the traitor who'd brought him down. My bunk was vandalized with crude messages. During meals, entire tables would clear out when I sat down. Anonymous notes appeared in my locker, ranging from threats to suggestions that I'd slept my way to my investigation victory. The worst part was that some of the abuse was coming from people I'd considered allies. Rodriguez, who'd witnessed my crucible success firsthand, made it clear he thought I'd gone too far in reporting Tank. Tank was tough, but he made real soldiers, he told anyone who'd listen. Now we're stuck with sensitivity training instead of combat preparation. The tension came to a head during a particularly brutal training exercise called Thunder Dawn, a massive war simulation that served as Storm Ridge's final exam. Recruits were divided into opposing forces and tasked with capturing and holding strategic objectives over a 72-hour period. Colonel Hayes personally oversaw the exercise, making it clear that performance here would determine final rankings and future assignments. For me, it was a chance to prove that my previous successes weren't flukes. For Tank's supporters, it was an opportunity to demonstrate that his traditional methods produced superior soldiers. The exercise began with our unit being assigned to capture and hold a communications tower deep in the desert. As squad leader, I was responsible for coordinating our 12-person team's approach and strategy. But minutes into the exercise, I realized I was dealing with something far worse than Tank's direct sabotage. I was facing a coordinated mutiny from within my own unit. Rodriguez, who'd been assigned as my second-in-command, began openly questioning every order I gave. When I outlined our approach to the objective, he suggested alternative plans that would split our force and leave us vulnerable. Other squad members followed his lead, creating a constant undercurrent of insubordination. Maybe we should radio for a different squad leader, Rodriguez suggested loudly enough for everyone to hear. Someone with more traditional qualifications. I realized I was facing the ultimate test. I could back down, let Rodriguez take unofficial control, and quietly accept a secondary role. Or I could assert my authority and risk open rebellion from half my unit. I chose the third option. Rodriguez, I said calmly, you're relieved of duty as second-in-command. Effective immediately. His face flushed red. You can't do that. Exercise regulations give squad leaders authority to modify team composition for tactical reasons, I replied. Parker, you're now my second. Parker, the quiet recruit who'd been in the jeep during my crucible drop-off, stepped forward with obvious reluctance. The rest of the squad watched tensely, waiting to see how this confrontation would resolve. Rodriguez took a step closer, his hand resting on his training weapon. I'm not taking orders from someone who got Tank fired for doing his job. The moment stretched taut like a wire about to snap. I could feel the entire exercise balancing on this single confrontation. If I backed down now, I'd never recover my authority. If Rodriguez actually drew his weapon, the exercise would become something far more dangerous than training. That's when Parker surprised everyone. Rodriguez, he said quietly, you're out of line. Martinez earned her position, and Tank got himself fired by cheating. You weren't there, Rodriguez shot back. You don't know what really happened. Actually, Parker continued, his voice gaining strength. I was there. I was in the jeep when Tank dropped her off at Checkpoint Alpha. I heard him tell the driver to take her to the extended starting point. I saw him laugh about it. The revelation hit the squad like a bomb. Several recruits who'd been supporting Rodriguez looked suddenly uncertain. Tank was sabotaging recruits, Parker continued. Not just Martinez, other people too. I saw him ordering defective equipment assignments, extended course parameters, impossible timeline requirements. He wasn't making better soldiers. He was breaking people down for his own sick entertainment. Rodriguez's face went through several different expressions: anger, confusion, and finally a grudging acknowledgement that he might have been wrong. Even if that's true, he said finally, it doesn't change the fact that she's not qualified to lead this mission. I'd had enough. Instead of arguing further, I pulled out my map and compass and began outlining a tactical approach that incorporated everything I'd learned about desert warfare, urban combat, and team coordination. Here's what we're going to do, I said, my voice carrying new authority. Rodriguez, you wanted traditional military tactics? Fine. You'll lead the frontal assault on the tower's main entrance. draw their attention, and keep them busy. I assigned roles to each squad member, creating a coordinated plan that used everyone's strengths while minimizing our weaknesses. But the real test came when we reached the objective. The communications tower was defended by a team of instructors led by Tank himself. Despite his suspension from training duties, Tank had been assigned to the opposing force as a guest expert. When he saw me leading my squad toward his position, his smile was visible even at a distance. The battle that followed was unlike anything I'd experienced at Storm Ridge. Tank's team fought with professional precision, using every advantage of superior position and firepower. But my squad, despite our earlier conflicts, began working together like a well-oiled machine. Rodriguez's frontal assault drew the defenders' attention exactly as planned. While they focused on his team's obvious approach, Parker led a flanking maneuver that took out their communications array. I coordinated both actions from an overwatch position, calling out target locations and tactical adjustments. For 40 minutes, we fought a running battle through the tower complex. Tank's team was skilled and experienced, but we had youth, energy, and something they didn't expect: perfect coordination between squad members who'd learned to trust each other under fire. The turning point came when Tank himself moved to reinforce a position that was about to be overrun. As he sprinted across open ground, I had a clear shot with my training rifle. For a split second, I hesitated, remembering all the humiliation and harassment he'd put me through. Then I took the shot. The training round caught Tank center mass, triggering the sensors that marked him as eliminated. He stopped in the middle of the courtyard, staring at me in disbelief. Eliminated came the announcement over the exercise speakers. Sergeant Major Morrison is out of play. 10 minutes later, we'd captured the communications tower and established defensive positions. My squad had achieved their objective with 0 casualties and minimal ammunition expenditure. As Tank walked past my position during his exit from the exercise, he stopped and looked me directly in the eye. "Well played, Martinez," he said quietly. Well played. It wasn't an apology, but it was acknowledgement. From Tank, that was probably the closest thing to respect I'd ever get. The Thunderdawn exercise results were announced 3 days later during a formal ceremony attended by Storm Ridge's entire command structure. Colonel Hayes stood at the podium, reading performance evaluations that would determine our final rankings and future assignments. Squad 7, led by Recruit Martinez, achieved objective capture in record time with 0 casualties, she announced. Their tactical coordination and adaptive problem-solving represent the highest standards of Storm Ridge training. I stood at attention with my squad, trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened. Not only had we succeeded despite the internal conflicts and Tank's opposition, we'd set a new performance standard. But the real vindication came when Colonel Hayes called me forward for individual recognition. "Recruit Martinez," she said, "your leadership during Thunderdawn exemplifies the qualities we seek to develop in all our graduates. You demonstrated tactical excellence, team coordination, and grace under pressure." She pinned a commendation medal to my uniform. The first time a recruit had received individual recognition during a final exercise ceremony. Furthermore, Colonel Hayes continued, effective immediately, Recruit Martinez is promoted to training assistant and will be joining our instructor development program. The auditorium fell silent. Instructor positions at Storm Ridge were typically reserved for graduates with years of field experience. For a recruit to be offered such a position straight out of training was unprecedented. But the biggest shock came when Colonel Hayes announced the results of Tank's formal investigation. Following a comprehensive review of training practices and recruit evaluations, Sergeant Major Morrison has been relieved of all duties and will face a military tribunal for conduct unbecoming an officer, falsification of official records, and systematic harassment of personnel under his command. A ripple of murmurs spread through the assembled recruits and instructors. Tank's career wasn't just over. He was facing potential criminal charges. "Let me be clear," Colonel Hayes continued, her voice cutting through the whispers. Storm Ridge produces elite soldiers through rigorous but fair training. Anyone who uses their position to target, harass, or sabotage recruits based on gender, background, or personal prejudice will be removed from this organization. After the ceremony, I was approached by several recruits who'd been quietly enduring their own harassment campaigns. Word had spread that speaking up was not only safe but encouraged. Within weeks, 3 more instructors were removed from training duties, and Storm Ridge implemented new oversight protocols to prevent future abuse. Rodriguez found me later that day, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Martinez," he said, "I owe you an apology. A big one." I looked at him steadily, waiting for him to continue. "I believed Tank because it was easier than admitting I was wrong about you. About women in combat roles. About what makes a good soldier." He paused, struggling with the words. "You saved my career during Thunder Dawn. Hell, you probably saved my life. Tank was turning us into bullies instead of soldiers." "We all make mistakes, Rodriguez," I replied. "The question is what we do after we realize we're wrong." "I want to do better," he said. "If you'll have me, I'd like to apply for your training assistant program when you get it running." I smiled, the first genuine smile I'd had in weeks. "We'll see. First, you'll need to unlearn some of Tank's lessons and remember why you wanted to be a soldier in the first place." 6 months later, I was running Storm Ridge's new adaptive leadership program, designed to help recruits from non-traditional backgrounds develop the skills and confidence needed for elite military service. Rodriguez was my first assistant instructor, and Parker had been accepted into the program as a participant. The program was small, only 12 recruits per cycle, but the results were remarkable. Our graduates consistently scored higher on leadership evaluations and showed better long-term retention rates than traditional programs. More importantly, the culture at Storm Ridge was changing. Female recruits still faced challenges, but they no longer faced systematic harassment. The old boys network that had protected instructors like Tank was being replaced by a merit-based system that valued results over connections. 1 year after Tank's removal, I received an unexpected visitor. Master Sergeant Williams knocked on my office door, holding an official-looking envelope. "Martinez," he said, "this came through official channels. Thought you'd want to see it." The letter was from the Judge Advocate General's office, informing me that Tank had been found guilty on all charges and sentenced to reduction in rank, forfeiture of pay, and dismissal from service. His military career was officially over. But the letter also contained something unexpected, a personal note from Tank himself. "Martinez," it read, "I spent 30 years in the military believing that toughness meant breaking people down until only the strongest survived. You taught me that real strength comes from building people up until they're stronger than they ever thought possible. I was wrong about you, about women in combat, and about what it means to be a soldier. I hope the changes you're making at Storm Ridge will prevent other instructors from making the same mistakes I did. You earned everything you achieved, and the military is better because of people like you. William Morrison." I read the note twice, then filed it away. It wasn't the apology I'd expected, but it was acknowledgement of something more important. That change was possible, even for people who seemed set in their ways. 2 years later, Storm Ridge's adaptive leadership program had expanded to include recruits from all backgrounds who showed potential but lacked traditional qualifications. The program had a 95% graduation rate and consistently produced some of the military's most innovative and effective leaders. I was promoted to captain and offered positions at several prestigious military academies, but I chose to stay at Storm Ridge. There was still work to do, still barriers to break down, still people who needed someone to believe in them when no one else would. My father had always told me that real strength comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down. It took Tank's harassment campaign for me to fully understand what he meant, but I'd learned the lesson well. Every morning when I walked across the training grounds where I'd once been humiliated and sabotaged, I remembered that moment in the desert when I'd almost given up. I thought about the choice I'd made to keep fighting, not just for myself but for everyone who would come after me. Tank had tried to break me by making my challenges impossible. Instead, he'd taught me that impossible was just another word for no one's figured out how to do it yet. The desert hadn't broken me. Tank's harassment hadn't broken me. And now I made sure that no recruit under my command would face those battles alone. Storm Ridge still produced elite soldiers, but we did it by building them up instead of tearing them down. And every time a recruit from a non-traditional background earned their commission, I knew my father would have been proud. The bullies never win in the end. They just teach their victims how to become stronger than they ever imagined possible. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.